Hello everybody and welcome to another video. Now, when I first decided I wanted to make videos about retro games, there were two games in particular that I wanted to speak about on the channel. The first of which was Panzer Dragoon Saga for the Sega Saturn, and I spoke about this last year, made a video about it, and it's a game I absolutely fell in love with. The other game is one called Snatcher. This was released in Europe and the United States in 1994 for Sega's somewhat ill-fated Sega or Mega CD add-on. For anyone unaware, it was an add-on for the Mega Drive or Genesis. It originally released in late 1991, early 92, and it allowed for the ability to play CD-ROM based games on the system, as well as bringing in a few additional enhancements. Now, discussion about the Mega CD as well as Sega's later add-on for the Mega Drive, the 32X, would be an entire video in of itself. But the Mega CD, when it released, had a fair bit of hype behind it, but really, it kind of has something of a mixed legacy. There were a handful of really good games for it. In particular, Sonic CD is held up by some fans as one of the better 2D Sonic games. But there were also a lot of really poor ones as well. There were a lot of companies that were trying to get in on the whole FMV game trend in the early 90s, thinking that because we would move to CD-ROM, it would allow for movie-like games. And it didn't. It really didn't. So ultimately, 1994, by the time Snatcher came round, support for the CD-ROM add-on, the Mega CD, was dwindling, and Sega were about to release the 32X, as well as go into the launch of the Saturn and make a few more poor business decisions. However, we are here to speak about Snatcher. So what exactly is it? It is a graphic adventure game, and it didn't actually start its life on the Mega CD. The original version of Snatcher was actually released all the way back in 1988. It was developed for the PC 8801 and MSX2 systems. The PC 8801 is a kind of home computer made primarily for the Japanese markets. The MSX2 is another home computer system that kind of saw popularity in Japan, South Korea, Argentina, Brazil, and a handful of other countries. The game would go on to be ported to and enhanced for the PC Engine in 1992, and then Konami, looking for a project for the Mega CD to release in the West, decided that a port of that would be ideal for the system, instead of going for a Night Trap-inspired FMV title. A wise decision. Interestingly, the Mega CD version of Snatcher is actually the only Western release of the game. It was actually ported to the PlayStation and Sega Saturn at a later date, but remained Japan only. The other really notable thing about the game is that it is the second game to be designed and directed by a certain Hideo Kojima. It was his other work after the original Metal Gear. Now, I'm fairly sure for a lot of you, Kojima needs no introduction, but I don't like to assume knowledge, so, for a very brief rundown, Hideo Kojima is a games designer, writer, producer, and director. He's best known for being the mastermind behind the Metal Gear franchise, which, with the entry Metal Gear Solid, helped usher in the stealth action genre of games. Beyond that, though, Kojima's worked on games like Police Knot, Zone of the Enders, Death Stranding. He worked on the ill-fated Silent Hills project and its playable teaser, PT, which took the world by storm all the way back in 2014. Unfortunately, Silent Hills was cancelled after something of a falling out between Kojima and the publisher Konami. This led to PT being delisted entirely, Kojima walking out and forming his own studio, which would go on to release the critically acclaimed Death Stranding. Kojima's work is known for being incredibly cinematic. It takes a lot of inspiration from movies and TV shows, but it also manages to blend this with engaging and creative gameplay. In addition, there's this really keen attention to detail across all of his titles, with players being rewarded for trying things off the beaten path, being rewarded with additional content, or funny moments. The Metal Gear Solid franchise, or Metal Gear franchise, is typically held up as one of the biggest and best examples of his work and style, with Metal Gear Solid 1 and 3 typically being held up as some of the greatest games of all time. And for me, being someone who grew up in the 90s, my first encounter with his work was Metal Gear Solid. I remember getting this demo with a copy of official UK PlayStation magazine. The demo for that month was just Metal Gear Solid. There was no other ones on the disc at the time. and it kind of gave you a good chunk of the opening of the game, from the initial landing to rescuing the DARPA chief or finding him. And for a short while, my 10-year-old brain didn't quite get it. It was unlike anything I had played before. I didn't actually like it at first. It was too hard, it was too complicated, but I persevered. I learned how it all worked. I learned how to manipulate the guards and such. I found all these little secrets and Easter eggs, and I really fell in love with how it played. Admittedly, the story kind of went over my head, but it was such a cool game, and so much of it stuck with me. Now, as I got older, I had similar experience with the other Metal Gear Solid titles. I played through and adored Metal Gear Solid 2. I played Metal Gear Solid 3, and I got a PS3 just for Metal Gear Solid 4. So I always took note of things that Kojima was working on, and I was one of those who was absolutely gutted to learn of the cancellation of Silent Hills, even if PT was just a little bit too scary for me. So this is partly why Snatcher has been on my radar for a while. Knowing it's one of his earlier games always intrigued me, but then also seeing what it is, this sci-fi influenced adventure game, just intrigues me even more. But what's it about? What is the story here? So you play the role of Gillian Seed. He's an amnesiac who has been assigned to the Junkers, a special task force created in response to the appearance of the game's titular Snatchers, robotic beings that have turned up, started snatching people away before adopting their appearance. Gillian is also married to a woman called Jamie, who unfortunately also suffers from amnesia. You see, both you and her were picked up at the same time, brought to this city. You can't remember much of your past except that you were both married. And the only thing you do really know beyond that is that there is a strong tie to the Snatchers. So in his role as a junker, Gillian must investigate the Snatchers, try to figure out who or what is behind them, and a means to stop them. So whenever this game was released, it always received pretty high critical acclaim. Unfortunately, it was not matched with high sales. It kind of did quite poorly commercially. This was no different for the Mega CD port. When it released, the Mega CD was kind of nearing the end of its life. We had the aforementioned 32X being released for the Mega Drive. We had Sega about to release the Sega Saturn. So there wasn't really much room for this to be promoted. It was said to have only sold a few thousand copies. And of course, that's led to it becoming quite the rare commodity. Copies of it go for between £400 to £500 last I checked. I actually did see a copy of this in a CEX in Middlesbrough once, and it was going for about £400. So when you add on the costs of a Mega Drive, which can be gotten quite cheap, but then the Mega CD add-on, playing it legally is quite a difficult and expensive task. But with all of that said, let's actually take a look at the game itself. Our game begins with a somewhat lengthy cutscene telling us about the state of the world so far. It turns out Moscow and a large chunk of Eastern Europe were taken out in 1996 by a biological weapon dubbed Lucifer Alpha. Many years after this incident in the city of Neo Kobe, a new threat to the world has emerged. The Snatchers, a being which absolutely looks like a Terminator. It's a really well animated and narrated cutscene. It does a good job of building intrigue, giving just enough information without actually being overwhelming. Even from this, I can see how lovely the visuals are in the game. It's got a pixel art style that really pops and shines, and I guess at the time really took advantage of what the Mega CD could offer. Let's go into Act 1. There's not too much setup here. We're straight into Junker HQ, ready to play the game. The gameplay here it's a menu-driven interface. You've got your image up top showing you your environment. It's where you are, you can see people who you can potentially speak to, and you select an item from a menu below for what you want to do, be it look, investigate, talk, or move. There are other context-sensitive options that might appear based on the situation. It kind of feels a little bit like a mix between a visual novel and a point and click. So we have a nice little discussion with our first character, Mika, at the reception. This gives us more information on Gillian, who he is, why he's here, and we get to go on a tour of Junker HQ and what it can offer. All flows really nicely, the dialogue's mostly voice acted, and it's decent enough. There's nothing awful going on here. It does sound of the time. Graphically, it's really, really lovely. The characters evoke a sort of late 80s anime style. Environments look great. And I have to add at this point that the main character actually reminds me a little bit of Columbo. I think it's the court. Whilst we're in Junker HQ, we get a quick introduction to some of the it's one of the other major gameplay mechanics the game has to offer, which is the shooting. Now, I did like it as this little section here to practice this before you encountered it properly in the game world. It reminded me of the ability to do a round or two of sparring in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade point and click, for anyone who has played that. The shooting isn't really too complicated. You've got this 3x3 grid. You move a reticle to the appropriate square with a D-pad, shoot with the C button when over an enemy. No reloading, no ammunition. It's just a shooting gallery of sorts. Also in the HQ, we are introduced to our robot companion, this sweet little robot called Metal Gear Mark II. As you've probably guessed, it is named after the titular robot machine from Kojima's previous title. They actually reference this in-game, the engineer stating that he built it based on specs taken from the Metal Gear of the Metal Gear incident, only this one wasn't made to harm people, only help. So it actually kind of establishes that this game happens somewhat in the future of the original Metal Gear timeline. At least it did before Kojima added a lot more stuff later on. I don't know where it will fit in that timeline. I'm presuming well after the events of probably Revengeance or such. All that done, time for our first assignment. Another junker, Jean Jack Gibson, needs help in the ruins of a factory outside of town. So into our turbo cycle we go. In the factory, it is a case of looking at, examining everything, progressing through the various rooms. We find Gibson's robot navigator at one point before running into Gibson himself. Or, in quite a gruesome scene, what is left of him. We examine his body, we find various clues and try to move on, but not before being attacked by a wave of small spider-like robots to close out the area. So a couple little things from this section. Unlike a lot of point and clicks of the era, and I don't know if it's fair to compare them to this, as this is a different style of game, but I know that people are going to be asking about how this might compare to something like Beneath a Steel Sky. It is not difficult to figure out what you're meant to do in the game so far. There was one bit where I got a little bit stuck, but all it came down to really was making sure you exhaust your options for looking at and investigating the scene until it naturally progresses. There wasn't really anything obtuse, there were no real puzzles here. That said, I did really enjoy the interactivity. It did make me feel like I was pushing the game forward through my actions and actually investigating something. The first proper shooting segment wasn't that difficult either. It was just a matter of spotting the robot as it appeared, getting yourself set up. At some points it's a little bit frantic, but I don't think anyone's going to struggle with this first bit. But my first impressions here are really, really good. I'm already looking forward to seeing how this continues to develop. So we return to HQ, we're given our next task, to find out why Gibson was targeted, what he was investigating. So we want to do some initial investigation at Junker HQ, going through the different rooms, seeing what he might have left behind, before going to Gibson's home to speak to his daughter. When we get there though, his daughter, Katrina, she won't let us in without verifying our identity and answering a few questions about her. But we don't have those answers to hand. So it's back to HQ to consult Jordan, the HQ's computer. Now I mentioned earlier that the game has a great way of making you feel like you are investigating the case, and this is a good example of that. You go to the computer, you can enter the name of a person you want information of. In this case it'll be Gibson or his daughter, and you have to go through that information and remember it, because when you go back you are going to be asked a question about it. You actually have to type in the answer instead of just picking it from a menu. So what I would say is be ready to write things down. In fact, I had to write a few things down over the course of the game, and this is something I really, really love. I remember playing, I think it was a game called Cruise for a Corpse as a kid, and me and my friend going through it, writing down what we had to do in order to trigger the next stage. I do like it when games kind of make you do things like that. I'm playing Riven at the moment, and that is a game where you have to take down notes while playing it, and I really like that. I like games that make you do something a little bit beyond. And this is a mechanic that will pop up again in the very next bit. So we speak to Katrina, we get the information, we find out Gibson has this informant called Napoleon. You need to speak to him, but he won't speak to you without a password. And that's one you can only learn by reading up on Napoleon, the historical figure that is, not the informant bloke. So you arrange this meeting with Napoleon, he directs you to a public square, and again, this is such a lovely environment, and this shows off some of the attention to detail and Easter eggs the game actually has. You'll see these billboards in the background. Some of them have phone numbers attached that you can call them via the in-game phone. Whilst we're there, we can also investigate and examine the area and get Gillian to do other little amusing things. I found a scene where he orders a lot of food from a place. There's apparently a scene where he can order a pizza at some point as well. There's also one particular bit I found, which I've kind of shown here. You get a phone number for Konami, and it has a message from someone talking about Snatcher and how excited they are for people to play the game. So one thing I recommend for people playing it is take your time, examine, explore everything, because you never know what you're going to find. Now, a little bit more investigation here leads us to a place called Outer Heaven, another lovely reference to Metal Gear. And while you are in Outer Heaven, you'll see more references to Konami titles while you're in there. Apparently in the original Japanese version, these were references to various bits of pop culture, but when they brought it over, fearing, legal action, they changed it to Konami references. Now, here we get a description of what our Snatcher we're looking for might have looked like in their human form. We go back to the computer Junket HQ to put it all together. This is one section I found a little bit awkward, as some of the descriptions could have matched 2 or 3 items in certain situations. In particular, the bony face threw me, and I ended up getting that wrong the first time. That said, I liked what I had to do here. It does make you feel like a detective, like you are piecing this investigation together. After you get our suspect, it's pretty much a straight sprint at the end of the first act. We do uncover who the Snatcher was, we get into some shootouts. It wraps up really nicely. We have plenty more questions, but more avenues to explore. Now, I won't go into what happened in Acts 2 and 3, but I will say I had a really positive experience for Act 1, and things just kept getting better as the game went on. My investigation took me on many brilliant twists and turns, it kept me guessing, but in a really good way, and it was completely engaging. Puzzle-wise, nothing really in the game that was too difficult or stumped me for a long time. Everything was pretty intuitive or quite easy to unsolve by just exhausting my options. Except for one puzzle. There is a section in the game where you need to decipher the name of a hospital from a picture you have. This picture says Orlean on it, and you learn that this is wrong, and you have to figure out, remembering what clues you have, what it could actually say. Unfortunately, when it asks you for the answer, it locks you into that moment, so you can't back out and check your inventory or anything like that. The answer ultimately does make sense, but when I came across it, it did throw me for a little bit, because I had forgotten that I had a particular item in my inventory. That said, beyond that moment, which was a little bit fiddly, there isn't much here in terms of difficulty. It's probably below a game like Ace Attorney in terms of how hard it is. Definitely not on the level of something like a Monkey Island or Beneath a Steel Sky. Not that this is a bad thing, because I do feel bad comparing it to them point and clicks, but I know that is what people are immediately going to jump for. But everything about this game, the story, the characters, the general feel of the world is brilliant. How hard it is doesn't really matter, but I know there are going to be many of you who might come here for the puzzles. Something else worth mentioning here, and it's a minor detail, but the very original version of this game actually ended at Act 2. Act 3 was created, I think, for the TurboGrafx version onwards. It didn't actually have much involvement from Kojima, if anything at all, but it was based on some of the original plans for the game, which I think was meant to have up to about 5 acts, or they were thinking of doing a sequel for it. Even without his involvement though, the ending is really satisfying. It wraps things up nicely, and has a nice lengthy cutscene there, so it feels like it was made by Kojima. So, all of that said, game complete, let's wrap this up. It's probably going to come as no surprise to anyone watching this, but I absolutely adore the game. It's an absolute must-play, and I would recommend it to anyone with an interest in point-and-clicks, cyberpunk thrillers, visual novels, or Hideo Kojima's work. I wasn't 100% sure what to expect going into it. I tried to avoid reading too much to avoid any spoilers, as I knew it was quite a narrative-driven work, and I'm really glad I did, because it has led to me finding what I think is one of my favourite kind of adventure games, sitting alongside the likes of Broken Sword, Curse of Monkey Island, and Beneath a Steel Sky. Where the game might fall down for a few of you is it is a lot more straightforward than the point-and-clicks I mentioned above. There aren't too many puzzles here, they're not especially tricky. To progress, it's a matter of examining and talking to everyone. Nothing madly obtuse, there's no weird combining of objects, and there's no rubber chickens with pulleys in the middle. Action sequence wise, they are what they are. They're simple, they're a little bit of a shooting gallery. They break up some of the investigative gameplay, but I don't think they're going to cause anyone any issues. That said, any of those criticisms are really, really minor. I am strongly urging everyone to check out the game regardless, because what it might lack in puzzles and action, it makes up for in everything else. There may be a few awkward moments of dialogue here and there in some of the scenes, but nothing that I think is going to ruin it for anyone. I think it is it's a great game. It's a really interesting part of gaming history that came from the mind of one of the biggest names in our industry. In Snatcher, you will see a lot of the DNA that would go on to shape some of Kojima's later works, be it the pop culture references, the cinematic style, the themes present, and the flow of dialogue. The one big kicker here is that if you want to own this game legally, you're going to have to fork out a lot of money for the actual Western version. Mega Drives, they're quite cheap, as I mentioned before. Mega CDs, I think they're about £100, and as a rare game, it's got a very high cost on top of that. Like I mentioned earlier, £400 to £500. So I think it's probably going to be an emulation job. And on that point, it really does surprise me that this and Kojima's other early work, Police Notes, have never seen a re-release on modern day platforms. Given the respect his name commands, I am really surprised that even back in the early PS3, early PS4 era, when they were kind of getting on, Konami didn't put together a double pack of sorts. Although, strangely enough, the TurboGrafx Mini, which released a couple of years ago, did have Snatcher on it, albeit it was the Japanese version. And speaking genuinely, I do think that if a double pack were to happen now, I think it would do really well. In the last few years, we've seen a renaissance in the world of point-and-clicks and visual novels. You need only look at what Capcom have done with things like the re-release of Ghost Trick, the Ace Attorney packs that have came out. You look at the success of the Danganronpa franchise, things like Steins Gate coming out and making it big. They have pushed visual novels out there. You've seen various dating simulators come out and make it big. And of course, you go back to that one thing, the association with Kojima. But that said, the well-documented falling out with Kojima and Konami does make it feel somewhat unlikely. Konami did go to a big effort to distance themselves from Kojima, scrubbing his name wherever they could, even going so far as to delist the critically acclaimed PT from online stores. It would be nice if something could be done. Either Kojima gets the rights to the franchise and sorts it out himself, or Kojima patch things up for just this one thing. Who knows? I, for one, would bloody love to see it happen, and I think it deserves to see it happen. So on the 1,000,000 to 1 chance that, someone from Konami or Mr. Kojima himself sees this, please make it happen. This is a damn good game, and I think more people need to play it and have an easy way to play it. With all that said, thank you all so much for taking the time to watch the video. I'd love to know if it's a title you did play yourself back in the day, if it's one you've played since, or if you're going to check it out after this cheeky little review. Do let me know in the comments below. As always, please do give the video a like, subscribe to the channel for more retro gaming content, and until next time, thank you once again for taking the time to watch this, and goodbye.